The air in Avalon Pines was always still, heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint, sweet perfume of pine trees. It was a planned community designed for tranquility, a place where every blade of grass, every exterior paint color, and every single second of a homeowner's leisure time was meticulously regulated. To a newcomer, it looked like paradise. To Elias, it felt like a silent, beautiful prison. Elias had moved to Avalon Pines for the quiet. After 2 decades in a bustling city, the constant noise had worn him down, a relentless, grating static in the background of his life. He was a woodworker, a craftsman who found solace in the simple, honest work of shaping lumber. He bought a modest house on a large, wooded lot at the edge of the community, drawn by the promise of undisturbed peace. The realtor had mentioned the Homeowners Association, of course, but had glossed over the details. "Just standard stuff," she had said, waving a hand dismissively. "Keeps property values high." He'd signed the paperwork without a second thought. It was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. The trouble began with a simple woodshed. Elias, a man who believed in the beauty of raw materials, wanted to build a small 10 by 12-foot structure at the back of his property to store his tools and a few choice pieces of lumber. He drew up the plans himself. A simple A-frame design with a single wide door, the entire structure to be built from sustainably sourced cedar and salvaged barnwood. He submitted the drawings to the Avalon Pines Architectural Committee, expecting a quick stamp of approval. What he received 3 weeks later was a terse email from the committee's president, a woman named Beverly Thorne. The rejection was categorical, citing a new, recently passed bylaw. "All exterior structures," the email read, "including but not limited to sheds, gazebos, and detached garages, must be constructed of non-porous, prefabricated materials to ensure visual harmony with the community's aesthetic." A line was bolded as if for emphasis. "All material must be approved by the committee prior to delivery to the property." Elias sighed, a long, weary exhalation that felt like it carried the weight of the city he had escaped. He called the committee's main number and spoke to a perky, unhelpful assistant. He tried to explain that cedar was an excellent, durable material, that it was in keeping with the natural feel of the wooded lot, and that the bylaw seemed to contradict the very name of the community. The assistant simply repeated the bylaw back to him, as if she were a programmed chatbot. Frustrated but not defeated, Elias decided to pivot. He was a woodworker after all. He would make a beautiful prefabricated shed built off-site. He would use tongue and groove cedar panels, a more modern and elegant material. He ordered the lumber, intending to have it delivered to a workshop he had rented in the next town over. The delivery date was set for the following Tuesday. On Monday afternoon, he received another email, this one from Beverly Thorne herself. It contained an invoice for a $500 fine and an attached photo. The photo was a grainy, zoomed-in shot of a single pallet of cedar planks sitting in his driveway. The invoice was for unauthorized material delivery. The email stated that he had violated the bylaw by having construction material on his property before receiving committee approval. The air in Avalon Pines suddenly didn't feel so still. It felt thick, suffocating. Elias had never been one for confrontation, but a cold, hard anger began to simmer in his gut. This wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. They had been watching him. They wanted to punish him for the mere act of trying to build something that was his. He paid the fine, but not out of compliance. He paid it to buy time. He would not be intimidated. He would not give in. He was a man who understood the intricate details of wood grain and the fundamental weakness of a flawed structure. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Beverly Thorne and her committee were a lot like the cheap plywood he refused to work with, outwardly smooth but rotten on the inside. Elias decided to find a weak point in their structure. He drove to the town hall and requested a copy of every bylaw and amendment ever filed by the Avalon Pines HOA. The stack of paper he received was an inch thick, a monument to petty legislation. He took it home and began to read, his eyes meticulously scanning the pages, just as they would an imperfect piece of lumber. He read for days. He found rules about lawn decorations, rules about trash cans, rules about the height of fences. He found the new bylaw about prefabricated materials, dated just 2 months prior. The document, however, was strangely incomplete. It stated that it was a provisional amendment that would be made permanent upon approval by the full membership at the upcoming annual general meeting. This meant it was still technically under review. It had not been legally ratified, so it was not yet enforceable. He found another thing, a much older bylaw that had been buried in the archives for over 20 years. Article 3, Section 4. Any and all new construction plans must be reviewed and approved by a licensed architect or engineer with at least 20 years of experience in structural design. This bylaw had clearly been forgotten, replaced by the committee's arbitrary judgment. Elias was a renderer, not an architect, but he had worked alongside some of the best in the business for years. He knew their blueprints and their methods. He had a deep, intuitive understanding of the engineering process, the very details that Beverly Thorne and her committee so clearly lacked. A small smile played on his lips. They thought they had trapped him with a simple bylaw. But they had handed him a blueprint for his own victory. He would not build his woodshed. He would build a case made of facts, evidence, and, most importantly, the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to his woodworking. He got to work. He spent the next week requesting historical land surveys from the county, digging through online public records of building permits, and even looking at satellite imagery of the neighborhood dating back to its foundation. He was looking for any and every inconsistency, any crack in the perfect facade of Avalon Pines. His computer screens were filled with maps and documents, and his garage was no longer a workshop, but a command center. He wasn't a city man anymore. He was a silent, patient hunter. He was the fox in the henhouse, and Beverly Thorne was about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you try to cage a man who came to a place for peace. He hadn't asked for this war, but if they wanted one, he would be ready. This is the first part of your story. Please let me know if you would like me to continue. Elias's garage, once a sanctuary of sawdust and fresh wood, had transformed into a command center. His woodworking tools sat dormant, gathering a thin layer of dust as his focus shifted from crafting furniture to meticulously building a case against Beverly Thorne and the Avalon Pines Committee. His computer screens glowed in the late-night darkness, filled with an intricate web of data. He spent days in the digital archives, a forensic scavenger hunting for every inconsistency. He requested and received the original geological survey for the land Avalon Pines was built on. The report, a dry technical document from the 1980s, detailed the soil composition, drainage patterns, and most importantly, the water table. The land was a delicate ecosystem, a pine forest balanced on a shallow aquifer. Any significant disruption to the natural water flow could cause major structural problems. His next discovery was a gold mine. Using his knowledge of digital cartography, he cross-referenced the original developer's blueprints with modern satellite imagery. The Avalon Pines community was built around a beautiful man-made lake at its center. The original blueprints, however, showed a much smaller natural pond in that location. The developer had significantly expanded the pond into a lake, a massive undertaking that would have required extensive excavation and a complete rerouting of the area's natural drainage. Elias knew this was a huge red flag. Such a project would have required a specific and highly detailed hydrological impact study. He dug through the public records, but there was no such study. The only documents he could find were vague permits for land beautification. This was a significant legal oversight, a clear violation of state environmental laws that had been glossed over in the rush to get the development built and sold. Beverly Thorne, as one of the original homeowners and an active member of the community, would have been aware of these changes. His investigation then took a more personal turn. Elias had a theory. If the committee was willing to cut corners with major projects, they were likely doing the same with smaller ones. He turned his attention to Beverly Thorne's own property, a sprawling, immaculate home on the lake's edge. He found Beverly's original landscaping permits. They were a thick stack of documents detailing every plant, every hedge, every paved path on her property. He cross-referenced these with satellite imagery from various dates. The most significant finding was a discrepancy in her front driveway. The original permit showed a simple paved two-car driveway. However, the current satellite images clearly showed a sprawling circular driveway with a large fountain in the center. There were no permits on file for this massive alteration. But that wasn't all. Elias, with his sharp eye, noticed another inconsistency. The hedges surrounding Beverly's property, which she regularly boasted about as historic boxwoods, were shown in the permit photos as being a mere 4 feet high. The current hedges were a towering 7 feet tall, a clear violation of a bylaw that limited hedges to a maximum of 6 feet. Beverly had, for years, been fining her neighbors for having hedges that were 1 or 2 inches over the limit, a petty act of hypocrisy that made Elias's blood boil. The final piece of his puzzle was the most damning. He had a contact, an old colleague from his urban exploration days who specialized in locating old and forgotten documents. Elias tasked him with a single mission: find the original engineering report for the entire Avalon Pines development. The report was a dense 200-page document that had been buried in a county archive for decades. When Elias finally received a digital copy, he found what he was looking for. The engineering report contained a detailed schematic of the area's underground utilities, including its old, abandoned septic system. The system was designed to be filled and sealed, but the report had a crucial note. A few access points had been left unsealed due to a lack of proper permits. One of these unsealed access points was located exactly where the committee's recently built community clubhouse now stood. Elias had his case. Beverly Thorne and her committee were not just petty bureaucrats. They were hypocrites who were enforcing unratified bylaws, violating their own rules, and building on land with known unresolved issues. He had built a case made of irrefutable facts and data, a structure far more solid than the flimsy lies of the committee. His revenge wouldn't be loud or angry. It would be methodical and undeniable. He would present his findings to the entire community, and he would watch as the perfect, suffocating paradise they had built crumbled under the weight of its own deception. He wasn't a woodworker right now. He was a demolition man, and Beverly Thorne's carefully constructed world was about to be taken apart, piece by piece. This is the second part of your story. Please let me know if you would like me to continue. The annual general meeting of the Avalon Pines Homeowners Association was held in the brand-new community clubhouse, a building that, unbeknownst to most, sat directly over a ticking time bomb of developer negligence. The room was packed, a sea of perfectly dressed homeowners seated on identical chairs. The air was charged with a mixture of polite tension and bottled-up resentment. Most residents had a fine to their name, a subtle reminder from the committee that conformity was non-negotiable. At the front of the room, behind a long table draped in a forest green tablecloth, sat the committee. Beverly Thorne, resplendent in a tailored power suit, occupied the center chair, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She had just completed her annual report, a glossy brochure detailing the committee's unprecedented success in maintaining property values and the visual harmony of the community. She had even included a photograph of Elias's woodshed plans, discreetly tucked into the non-approved projects section. "As you can see," Beverly said, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction, "we have successfully upheld the high standards that define our community. We have at times been forced to make difficult decisions to ensure compliance, But this diligence is why Avalon Pines remains a premier place to live. A few residents, new to the community and still starry-eyed about its perfection, clapped politely. A few older residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Now," Beverly continued, her eyes sweeping over the room, "we have time for a brief open forum. Does anyone have any questions regarding the report or any suggestions for a new bylaw we might consider?" The room was silent. No one dared to speak. Beverly smiled. This was her favorite part of the meetings, the moment when everyone acknowledged her total and complete authority. "If there are no questions," she said, her hand already reaching for the gavel, "then I will declare this meeting." "I have a question." The voice was calm, measured, and came from the back of the room. 100 heads turned to see Elias standing, holding a small laptop and a projector remote. Beverly's triumphant expression soured. She had not expected this. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice a brittle veneer of civility, "I believe your issue has already been addressed." "It has," Elias replied, his voice still calm, "but I believe I've discovered a few discrepancies in your report that the community might find illuminating." Before Beverly could object, Elias clicked a button. The projector whirred to life, and a complex GIS map of Avalon Pines filled the large screen behind her. Murmurs rippled through the room. "What is this? A protest?" Beverly said, her voice rising in frustration. "This is not a protest, Mrs. Thorne," Elias said, clicking the remote again. "This is evidence." He started with the small things. The screen showed an overlay of Beverly's own home. A glowing red line, sharp and undeniable, traced the outline of her sprawling circular driveway. Next to it, he projected her original permit, which showed a simple 2-car driveway. The on-screen text was bold and precise. Beverly Thorne's driveway, unpermitted and unapproved. Gasps echoed through the room. A woman in the front row, who had recently been fined for a small patio stone, put a hand over her mouth in shock. Elias clicked again. The screen now showed a side-by-side comparison of her historic boxwood hedges from a decade ago and a recent satellite image. The 4-foot hedges from the permit now towered at 7 feet. Another on-screen text overlay appeared. Bylaw Article 6, Section A, hedges limited to 6 feet. Beverly's composure began to crack. Her face, once a mask of smug satisfaction, was now a portrait of furious disbelief. "This is an invasion of privacy! This is harassment!" she shrieked. Elias remained impassive. "All of this is public record, Mrs. Thorne, just as my woodshed plans were." He then went for the kill. The screen shifted to an aerial view of the entire Avalon Pines development. A glowing green line appeared, tracing the original natural pond. Then a second line, blue and sprawling, appeared, showing the massive man-made lake. The original developer's blueprints showed a natural pond, Elias narrated calmly. The lake you see today required a massive excavation. A project of this magnitude required a hydrological impact study, a key document that is missing from all public records. This is a clear violation of state environmental laws. A collective murmur, louder this time, swept through the room. This wasn't petty. It was serious. Finally, Elias displayed his trump card. The screen now showed a detailed schematic of the area's old, abandoned septic system. A single, small red circle pulsed ominously on the map. He then zoomed in, revealing the location of the unsealed access point. A second image appeared, a satellite view of the community clubhouse. The red circle pulsed directly beneath its foundation. "According to the original engineering report," Elias said, his voice now a final definitive hammer, "this community clubhouse, which the committee so proudly built, sits directly on top of an unsealed septic system access point. A significant collapse or contamination event is not a possibility. It's a probability." The room erupted. The polite tension evaporated, replaced by shouting and panicked whispers. A few people stood up, pointing at Beverly, their faces contorted in anger. Beverly Thorne, the woman who had wielded bylaws like a weapon, was now exposed, her authority and her perfect world crumbling before her. The members of the committee, suddenly eager to distance themselves, stared at their laps. An older man, a resident of the community for 25 years, stood up. "I'm calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in the entire board," he announced, his voice booming with authority. The vote was unanimous. Beverly Thorne, her face pale and drawn, stood alone as the residents she had controlled for years marched out of the clubhouse. Elias stood there, his work done. He had not sought revenge, he had simply revealed the truth. The perfect, suffocating paradise of Avalon Pines was shattered, but in its place, a real community was finally starting to emerge. He had his victory, and soon he would have his peace. The silence that followed the unanimous vote of no confidence was more deafening than the shouting that had preceded it. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality collapsing. Beverly Thorne stood alone at the front of the room, her composure finally shattered. The defiant smirk had been replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fury and humiliation. Her eyes, once sharp with authority, darted around the room, settling on Elias, who stood calmly in the back. The older man who had called for the vote, his name was Arthur, walked to the front table. "The committee is hereby dissolved," he announced, his voice steady. "Until a new one can be elected, a provisional board will be formed. We will start with a full audit of the HOA's financials, and Mr. Thorne's evidence will be turned over to the proper authorities." Beverly's husband, a man who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, finally stepped forward. "You can't do this, Arthur. This is illegal. We'll sue every single one of you," he threatened, his voice trembling with impotent rage. "You can try, Robert," Arthur replied, gesturing to Elias's laptop. "But I think we'll be too busy working with the county to unravel a 20-year-old developer fraud. I suggest you both hire a good lawyer." As the room began to empty, a few people approached Elias. They offered him handshakes and quiet words of thanks. They asked him if he would consider running for the new board. Elias simply smiled and shook his head. "I came here for peace and quiet," he said. "I think my work here is done." He left the clubhouse, the hum of conversations fading behind him, and walked back to his quiet, wooded lot. For the first time since he had moved to Avalon Pines, the air felt genuinely fresh, untainted by unspoken resentments and tyrannical rules. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity for the rest of the community. Arthur and his provisional board worked tirelessly. The audit revealed what Elias had suspected. Beverly had been misusing HOA funds for years. She had billed the association for extravagant landscaping on her own property, for consulting fees that went directly to her husband's shell company, and for expensive security systems that only covered her street. The fines she had levied against residents were nothing more than a personal slush fund. The evidence was irrefutable. The community banded together in a way Elias had never expected. The woman who had been fined for her patio stones organized a fundraising effort to cover the legal fees for the class action lawsuit filed against Beverly and her husband. The man who had been fined for his hedges led a team of volunteers to tear down the illegal, overgrown boxwoods on Beverly's property, replacing them with a more natural native landscape. The spirit of shared purpose was infectious. Beverly and her husband fought back, but their perfect world was crumbling. The county launched an investigation into the original developer, a firm that had long since disbanded, leaving behind a trail of falsified documents and shoddy work. Their once immaculate home was now the epicenter of a legal storm, with investigators, lawyers, and angry residents swarming their property. Their pristine lawns were scarred with tire tracks. Their grand circular driveway was marked with orange cones and police tape. One afternoon, Elias was in his garage, finally getting back to his woodworking. He was shaping a piece of cedar, the smell of the wood a welcome relief from the scent of digital maps. Arthur walked in, a relieved smile on his face. "It's over, Elias," he said. "The lawsuit is moving forward. Beverly and her husband are selling the house. They have no choice. The whole community wants them gone." Elias nodded, his eyes on the piece of wood in his hands. He hadn't sought this, but he was glad it was done. "We want you to be the new president," Arthur said, holding out a hand. "You got us out of this. You're the one everyone trusts." Elias paused his work. He looked at Arthur, a man who had found his own strength through this ordeal. "Thank you, Arthur," he said honestly. "But no, I'm a woodworker. I'm a man who builds things with his hands. I don't want to run a community. I just want to live in it." Arthur understood. He smiled and shook Elias's hand. "We'll be sure to approve that woodshed for you," he said. Elias finally built his woodshed. It was a simple, sturdy structure, a testament to his craftsmanship. He built it from the same cedar that had been the subject of his first fine, and he took immense satisfaction in every nail he drove into the wood. The community, now free of Beverly's tyranny, was changing. Residents smiled and waved. Kids played in the streets. Neighbors helped each other with their yards, a newfound sense of shared purpose replacing the old, suffocating conformity. Elias had not come to Avalon Pines to be a hero. He had come for peace. And as he stood in his backyard admiring his woodshed, listening to the quiet, genuine sounds of a community finding its true identity, he finally found it. The air was still, heavy with the scent of fresh-cut cedar, and for the first time it felt like home. The dust from the great HOA upheaval in Avalon Pines had begun to settle. Beverly and her husband, Robert, had fled the community, their pristine, now scarred property a monument to their downfall. The community, once a quiet, suffocating place of enforced conformity, was now a buzzing hive of activity and newfound camaraderie. Arthur, the provisional president, was a man of action, and he had a full slate of items to tackle. The most immediate concern was a full, independent inspection of the entire development. Elias's evidence presented to the county had revealed that the original developer had taken shortcuts. The unsealed septic system access point beneath the clubhouse was just the tip of a very large iceberg. The new provisional board hired a team of civil engineers and inspectors to perform a full audit of the infrastructure, from the roads to the drainage systems. What they found was a terrifying portrait of negligence and cheap construction. The man-made lake at the center of the community, once a point of pride, was slowly leaking, its liner having been installed improperly. The original engineering reports had warned the developer about the high water table, and without the proper lining and drainage, the entire lake was slowly creating a bog beneath several homes. The homes, built on filled dirt, were now in danger of developing serious foundation problems. This new crisis brought a fresh wave of panic to the community. The residents, once so united in their fight against Beverly, were now turning on each other. The homeowners whose properties were closest to the lake were demanding that the HOA pay for the expensive million-dollar fix. The residents on the outskirts of the community, whose homes were safe, argued that they shouldn't have to foot the bill for a problem that didn't affect them. The old, suffocating conformity had been replaced by a new, more dangerous form of division. Arthur, a man who had only wanted to get Beverly out, found himself in a position of authority he never wanted. He was now a mediator, trying to hold a fractured community together. He called a town hall-style meeting at the community park, hoping to foster a sense of shared purpose. But the meeting quickly devolved into a shouting match. A woman whose patio had been sinking began to scream at a man whose property was on high ground. The old grudges, the ones Beverly had so carefully cultivated with her fines and punishments, were suddenly out in the open, raw and festering. Elias, who had come to the park simply to sit on a bench and enjoy the quiet, found himself a reluctant observer. The calm he had so desperately sought was shattered by the cacophony of his neighbors' anger. They were not fighting a single bully anymore. They were fighting each other. That evening, Arthur came to Elias's garage, his face a portrait of exhaustion. He had a glass of bourbon in his hand and a look of defeat in his eyes. "I can't do it, Elias," he said, taking a long sip. "I can't hold them together. They're all turning on each other. They're all acting like Beverly." Elias paused his work. He looked at Arthur. He knew Arthur wasn't a bad man, he was just a tired man. Elias also knew that a community, like a piece of wood, had its own grain, its own unique flaws. You couldn't force it to be something it wasn't. You had to work with its natural tendencies. "They're scared, Arthur," Elias said, placing his chisel on the workbench. "They've just lost a perfectly good villain to blame everything on. They need a new one. And right now, they're looking at each other." Arthur sighed. "So what do we do? We're looking at $1 million repair bill. The old developer is gone. Who's going to pay for it? We have to figure this out before we go to the general election." Elias was silent for a moment. He hadn't wanted to get involved, but he knew he couldn't stand by and watch his neighbors destroy themselves. He walked over to his computer and pulled up his original GIS maps. He began to click and drag, combining different layers of data, the original land surveys, the hydrological reports, the satellite imagery. "The key is not to find a person to blame," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "The key is to find the flaw in the design." He zoomed in on a detail he had overlooked during his initial investigation, a small, unassuming note on the original developer's blueprint. The note referenced a specific clause in the developer's contract, a clause that had been filed away and forgotten, a clause that, in a bizarre and beautiful twist of fate, could be the key to their salvation. The silence in Elias's garage was a stark contrast to the angry roar of the town meeting just hours before. Arthur sank into a chair, the empty bourbon glass a testament to his defeat. He had tried to be the leader the community needed, but he had failed. He had watched the perfect harmony of Avalon Pines crumble into a hostile mess, and it was a sight that chilled him to the bone. Elias walked over to his workbench, his hands moving with the easy familiarity of a man who understood how to fix things. He picked up a piece of cedar, its grain smooth and predictable, a welcome relief from the chaos of human nature. "They're scared, Arthur," Elias said, his voice calm. "They've just lost a villain. They're used to having a single point of blame, and now they don't know where to direct all that anger." Arthur sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So what do we do? We're a community on the brink. We're looking at $1 million repair bill. The old developer is a ghost. Who's going to pay for it?" Elias was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on his computer screen. He hadn't wanted to get involved, but he knew he couldn't stand by and watch his neighbors destroy themselves. He began to click and drag, combining different layers of data, the original land surveys, the hydrological reports, and the satellite imagery. His fingers moved with a quiet, practiced precision. "The key is not to find a person to blame," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "The key is to find the flaw in the design." He zoomed in on a detail he had overlooked during his initial investigation. It was a small, unassuming note on a blueprint dated from the very beginning of the development, a detail so mundane it had been filed away and forgotten. The note referenced a specific clause in the developer's original contract, a clause that had been filed with the county and had never been rescinded. "What is it?" Arthur asked, leaning forward, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "It's a rider," Elias replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "A forgotten amendment. This original contract, which the developer had to file with the county, included a legal mandate for them to set up an environmental remediation escrow fund. It was a contingency fund to cover any unforeseen issues related to the land's history as a bog." Arthur's eyes widened. "A fund? After all these years?" "It's dormant, but it's still legally active," Elias explained. "The developer's holding company, though officially dissolved, is still the legally bound custodian of the fund. We just need to find a way to make them pay." The challenge was immense. The money was there, but it was buried in a legal labyrinth guarded by a faceless corporation. The community would have to sue the original developer's defunct company, a complex and expensive legal battle. This would require the residents to unite and contribute to a legal fund, a hard sell after their last meeting. "We have to call another meeting," Arthur said, his voice now filled with a newfound energy. "We have to show them this. We have to show them that there's a way out of this mess." The second town hall meeting was called 2 days later. The tension was thicker than before, a palpable hostility hanging in the air. People avoided eye contact. A woman from the low-lying area, whose patio was sinking, sat in the front row, glaring at the man from the high ground, whose home was safe. It was clear the anger had not subsided. When Elias and Arthur got to the front of the room, Arthur began to speak, his voice hesitant at first. He tried to apologize for the last meeting, but he was quickly interrupted by a chorus of angry questions. Elias stepped forward, taking the remote from Arthur. He didn't speak. He simply clicked a button, and the screen behind him came to life. He started with the familiar, with the images of the perfectly manicured lawns, the pristine homes, the beautiful but flawed community of Avalon Pines. He then projected a new map, one he had spent the last 2 days creating. It showed the entire development overlaid with hydrological data. He showed them how the leaking lake was creating a new artificial water table that was slowly seeping into the ground beneath the homes built on fill dirt. The houses most at risk were marked in red. The anger in the room slowly began to drain away, replaced by a dawning sense of shared dread. The map did not lie. Then, Elias projected an image of the forgotten contract writer. The legal jargon filled the screen, but Elias's voice, calm and steady, cut through it all. He explained in simple terms what he had found, explaining that the $1 million solution was already there, waiting for them. He outlined the plan: hire a good lawyer, file a class action lawsuit, and use the money from the escrow fund to pay for the repairs. He showed them the math. The cost of the lawsuit, divided among every homeowner, was a small fraction of what it would cost to fix a single home's foundation. The room was silent. The woman from the front row looked at the man from the high ground, and for the first time, a flicker of understanding passed between them. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about something bigger. The fight wasn't against each other. It was against a single, deceitful entity. A man in the back raised his hand. "What if they fight back?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "They'll fight," Elias said. "But we have the evidence. We have the maps. We have the truth on our side. And they are fighting a unified community, not a handful of angry individuals." Arthur, seeing the mood shift, stepped forward. "We need a vote," he said, his voice strong with conviction. "A vote to pursue legal action against the developers and to fund a class action lawsuit. This is our chance to take back our community." The motion passed with a resounding majority. Elias watched, a quiet observer. He had not sought to be a hero, but he had given his neighbors what they needed: a clear path out of the darkness. The community of Avalon Pines, once a paradise built on a lie, was finally building a solid, honest foundation. The unanimous vote was a moment of fleeting triumph. The community had found a common enemy, but the war was far from over. A few days later, Arthur and a small delegation of homeowners, guided by Elias's meticulous research, found themselves in a high-rise law office in the city, far from the manicured lawns of Avalon Pines. They sat across from a corporate litigation lawyer named Marcus Vance. He was a man with a reputation for winning unwinnable cases against faceless corporations, a legal pit bull with a mind as sharp as a scalpel. He listened, impassive, as Arthur explained the situation, outlining the history of the HOA, Beverly's tyranny, Elias's digital cartography, and the forgotten escrow fund. Vance leaned back in his leather chair, a cynical smile playing on his lips. "It's a beautiful story," he said, "and your evidence is compelling. But it's not enough. They're not fighting Beverly Thorne anymore. They're fighting a holding company. They'll bury us in paperwork, bleed us dry with legal fees, and make this a 5-year process. We need more than a dormant fund. We need a smoking gun." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The group left Vance's office feeling defeated. The initial unity had been a fleeting illusion, replaced by the grim reality of the legal system. The community legal fund, started with such hope, was barely enough to cover the retainer. The residents, once so eager to fight, were now skeptical, the initial fire in their eyes extinguished by the cold light of reality. Elias, however, refused to be deterred. He went back to his garage, to the sanctuary of his workbench and his maps. If a dormant fund wasn't enough, he reasoned, then the smoking gun had to be in the land itself. He began a new, even more meticulous investigation. He didn't look at maps this time. He looked at people. He went to the town's historical society and pulled out old newspaper articles about the original developer, Pioneer Developments. The firm had been a local business, not a faceless corporation. The lead engineer on the project, a man named George Finch, had been a pillar of the community, a man whose name was on the original bronze plaque at the entrance to Avalon Pines. The name sent a shiver down Elias's spine. Finch. The same last name as Beverly. He had a feeling it was more than a coincidence. He spent weeks digging through old archives, and what he found was a trail of deceit that went back decades. Pioneer Developments had been a partnership between a group of local businessmen who had gone bankrupt and then formed a series of shell companies to hide their assets. George Finch, the lead engineer, was one of them. And the Environmental Remediation Escrow Fund wasn't a contingency fund. It was a way for them to siphon money off the project, a legal loophole to fund their new, more profitable ventures. The fund was a mirage. It was empty. The money had been spent long ago. The real smoking gun was in an old, yellowed invoice from a local concrete company. The invoice was for a small $200 job that was billed to Pioneer Developments a few months before the company went under. The invoice was for a cement seal for the main effluent access point. This was the same unsealed septic system that sat directly under the clubhouse. The invoice proved that the company knew about the problem and had deliberately chosen not to fix it. This was not a flaw in the design. It was a criminal act. Elias had his evidence. He had a motive, a clear trail of deceit, and proof of a criminal act. But he had no way to prove it. The paper trail was too thin, and the men who had committed the crime were long gone. Or so he thought. He realized he needed a human element. He needed to find someone who knew the truth, someone who was there. He found a small, almost unreadable note on the invoice, a phone number for the concrete company's manager. He took a chance and called it. A tired, old voice answered. It was the manager, now retired, and he remembered the job. He remembered it because it was a small job that the developer had refused to pay for, and he had a folder full of angry, frustrated emails from the lead engineer, George Finch. Elias felt a surge of hope. He had a witness. He had a paper trail. He had the truth. He called Arthur, his voice trembling with a renewed sense of purpose. "Arthur," he said, "I found the smoking gun. It wasn't a fund. It was a man." He then contacted Marcus Vance, the cynical lawyer who had dismissed him weeks ago. "I'm ready to proceed," he said. "I have a witness." Vance's cynicism was replaced by a flicker of interest. He told Elias to send him all the evidence. The lawsuit was officially filed a week later. The residents of Avalon Pines, now united by a new, more powerful form of outrage, watched in stunned silence as the legal battle unfolded. They were no longer fighting each other. They were fighting a ghost from the past, a phantom of their own creation. The lawsuit was a long shot, but with Elias's evidence and Vance's legal expertise, they finally had a fighting chance. The community, once on the brink of implosion, was now bound together by a single powerful thread: the pursuit of justice. The residents, once so divided, were now a single unified force, and the old developer's ghost was about to learn a very hard lesson. The war had just begun. The lawsuit, a document filled with Elias's evidence and Marcus Vance's legal jargon, landed like a stone in the calm waters of the corporate world. The old developer's holding company, now managed by a team of sharp, amoral lawyers, responded swiftly. They filed motions to dismiss, to delay, and to bury the case in so much paperwork that the community of Avalon Pines would be forced to give up. They were fighting a war of attrition, banking on the fact that a small group of homeowners, no matter how unified, could never outlast a billion-dollar legal machine. Back in Avalon Pines, the initial fire of unity began to flicker. The first bill from Marcus Vance's office arrived, a stark reminder that justice was not free. It was a fair bill, detailing every hour of research and every motion filed, but to the residents, it was a terrifying symbol of the financial abyss they were staring into. Whispers started again. "What if we lose?" people asked. "What if this ruins us?" The anger that had united them was slowly turning into fear. Arthur, now the official head of the new HOA, found himself playing the role of a wartime general. He held meetings, his voice hoarse from trying to rally his neighbors. He explained the legal process, the need for patience, and the strength of their evidence. But the faces in the room were no longer defiant. They were tired. Elias, for his part, went back to his garage, but his peace was gone. The weight of the community's hope rested on his shoulders. He was no longer just a woodworker. He was the man who had started this war. He felt the tension from his neighbors. The quick waves and polite smiles had been replaced by hesitant nods and averted glances. He was no longer a reclusive hero. He was a walking reminder of the financial peril they were all in. A few weeks later, Marcus Vance called Elias. "I have good news and bad news," he said, his voice flat. "The good news is they've stopped with the dismissal motions. They've agreed to a settlement conference. The bad news is it's not a negotiation. It's a show of force." The settlement conference was held in a neutral location, a large, impersonal conference room in a city hotel. The Avalon Pines delegation consisted of Elias, Arthur, and a handful of other residents. They sat across from a small army of lawyers and one imposing silver-haired man, who was introduced as Mr. Harrison, the senior partner of the firm managing the developer's assets. He was the ghost from the past, a man who had known George Finch personally. The conference was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The lawyers presented a lengthy, detailed report of the developer's bankruptcy, arguing that they had no legal obligation to a defunct company. Mr. Harrison looked directly at Elias. "You've done some impressive work," he said, "but you've made a fundamental error. Your little paper trail is just that, a paper trail. A single invoice from a bankrupt company. It proves nothing. We have endless resources. You have a few $1,000s and a community that's already buckling under the pressure." He then slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a counteroffer. They would pay for a new clubhouse, a brand new modern building with a new septic system, all on their dime. In return, the community would drop the lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement, forever waiving their right to pursue any and all legal action against them. Arthur's face lit up. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He looked at Elias, a question in his eyes. But Elias was staring at Mr. Harrison. He was looking at his face, at the cold, hard certainty in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a man who was negotiating. He was looking at a man who was hiding something. The counteroffer was too good. He knew instinctively that it was a trap. "No," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not taking the deal." A ripple of shock went through the Avalon Pines delegation. Arthur looked at him with an expression of disbelief. The lawyers across the table, however, simply smiled. Elias knew he had made the right choice. He had not started this war for a new clubhouse. He had started it for the truth. As they left the conference, Arthur's anger was palpable. "What are you doing, Elias?" he said, his voice a low growl. "We could have a new clubhouse. We could be done with this. Now what do we have? Nothing." "We have them, Arthur," Elias said, a glimmer of a plan in his eyes. "We have them exactly where we want them." The counteroffer, Elias realized, wasn't about the clubhouse. It was a confession. They were scared. They were scared of something Elias hadn't found yet. He had his smoking gun, but now he had to find the bullet.
The rejection of the settlement offer ignited a new fire in Elias. He knew the lawyers' overconfidence was a mask for their fear. He had found a paper trail, but now he needed to find the real story behind it, the human element. He needed to find out why they were so eager to settle for so much money. His investigation took a new turn. He stopped looking at legal documents and started looking at social media. He started with Mr. Harrison, the senior partner from the firm that was managing the developer's assets. He found his online presence to be surprisingly public for a man who claimed to be so private. He found an old blog post from a few years ago that was filled with pictures of a massive, sprawling estate. It was called Stonebridge Manor, and it was a project Harrison was incredibly proud of. The blog post detailed how he had personally overseen the project from start to finish, from the acquisition of the land to the final construction. It was his crowning achievement, but Elias had a hunch. He used his GIS software and cross-referenced the property lines of Stonebridge Manor with the original land surveys of Pioneer Developments. The properties were in two different counties, but they were in the same watershed. He found a small, almost imperceptible detail on the old survey maps of Stonebridge Manor, a detail that was filed away and forgotten. It was a single, small red circle that pulsed ominously on the map. He then cross-referenced that with old news articles. He found a few articles about a minor contamination issue on Stonebridge Manor during construction. The issue was quickly and quietly resolved, and the local news outlets, which were owned by the same company, never mentioned it again. Elias's blood ran cold. The contamination was not minor. The maps proved it. They had simply buried the toxic waste and covered it with a beautiful, expensive home. Mr. Harrison had his own hidden secret, his own ticking time bomb, and Elias had just found it. Elias's mind raced. The reason for their generous offer wasn't a show of force. It was an act of desperation. They were trying to silence him. If Elias could prove that Mr. Harrison's perfect manor was built on a lie, he would not only win the lawsuit, but he would also expose a criminal act that could send Mr. Harrison to prison for a very long time. He called Arthur, his voice filled with a quiet sense of purpose. "Arthur," he said, "I know why they're so scared. I know what they're hiding. They're not just trying to protect a defunct company, they're trying to protect themselves." He outlined his plan. They would not sue Mr. Harrison personally. They would sue his company for reckless endangerment, a legal term for exposing the public to a known danger. They would not ask for money. They would ask for a court-ordered investigation into the land on which Stonebridge Manor was built. The media, which had been so hesitant to cover their story, would not be able to ignore the potential for a new, even more scandalous story. The court date was set for a month later. The media was there, but they were there for Mr. Harrison. He was a pillar of the community, a man who had built his reputation on honesty and integrity. The Avalon Pines delegation, on the other hand, looked like a group of paranoid, vengeful neighbors. The trial was a blur of legal jargon, but Elias's plan was simple. He took the stand and told his story. He didn't accuse Mr. Harrison of anything, he simply laid out the facts. He showed them the maps, the news articles, and the evidence of the contaminated land on which the clubhouse was built. He then pulled out his ace in the hole. A new map, a court-approved document that showed the land on which Stonebridge Manor was built. He showed them the pulsing red circle on the map, a symbol of the buried toxic waste. The room was silent. Mr. Harrison's face, once so calm and composed, was now pale. He had known about the waste. He had simply buried it, and now it was a ticking time bomb, a secret that could destroy not only his career, but also his life. He was a man who had built his entire life on a lie, and Elias, a simple woodworker, had exposed him with nothing more than a few maps and a lot of patience. The verdict was unanimous. The court ruled in favor of the community of Avalon Pines and ordered a full, transparent investigation into the land on which Stonebridge Manor was built. The media, which had been so skeptical, now had their story. Mr. Harrison's career was over. His reputation was ruined. He was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a disgraced criminal. The community of Avalon Pines had won. They had their money, but more importantly, they had their dignity. They had fought a war against a powerful, corrupt system, and they had won. They were no longer a community of strangers. They were a family. They were a testament to the fact that even the smallest voices can be heard if they are armed with the truth.
The verdict was a seismic event that sent a shockwave through the corporate world and the perfectly manicured lawns of Avalon Pines. A collective cheer erupted in the courtroom, but the real victory was unfolding outside. News vans, which had been skeptical and quiet for weeks, were now broadcasting live. The story of a simple woodworker and his neighbors taking down a powerful corporate fraudster was a media sensation. The same reporters who had dismissed Elias as a paranoid conspiracy theorist now spoke of him as an unlikely hero. The court-ordered investigation into Stonebridge Manor began immediately. The pristine grounds of Mr. Harrison's perfect estate, the crowning achievement of his career, were torn open by excavators and environmental specialists. The perfect lawns, the sprawling gardens, the elegant walking paths, all of it was ripped away to reveal the toxic legacy buried beneath. The images were broadcast on every news channel, a raw, undeniable testament to the lies that had been built on top of a buried crime. Mr. Harrison's career was over, his reputation in ruins, and he was no longer a pillar of the community, but a disgraced criminal. In Avalon Pines, the residents, now united in victory, held a small impromptu celebration in the community clubhouse. The same room that had been the site of their oppression and later their rebellion was now filled with laughter and a genuine sense of camaraderie. Arthur, the weary general who had led the troops, was now the beaming leader of a unified community. He stood on the clubhouse stage, a humble man in a simple button-down shirt, and thanked everyone. "We won," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "because we had a truth-teller in our midst." He then stepped aside, gesturing to Elias. Elias, uncomfortable in the spotlight, simply smiled and accepted their praise with quiet humility. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who had simply done what was right. He had found his way back to his home, to his workshop. He looked at the unfinished piece of wood on his workbench, and for the first time in months, he felt a familiar sense of calm. He had sought peace in Avalon Pines, and in a way, he had found it, but not in the way he had expected. He had found it not in the absence of conflict, but in the triumph over it. The community had a new purpose. Their lawsuit was settled, and they had enough money to fix the clubhouse and the polluted land. But they decided to do something more. They used a portion of the funds to create a community foundation dedicated to helping other HOAs fight against corruption and deceit. They called it the Avalon Pines Community Foundation, a testament to the fact that even the smallest voices can be heard if they are armed with the truth. They used their story as a powerful example of what can happen when a community unites against a powerful, corrupt system. Elias, a simple woodworker, had taught his neighbors a valuable lesson, that the most powerful tools aren't those that build, but those that expose. The perfect, suffocating paradise of Avalon Pines was gone, but in its place, a real, unified community had finally emerged. Elias, in turn, had found a new purpose. He still loved his woodworking, but now he had something more. He had a story to tell, a story of an unlikely hero who, armed with nothing but a few maps and a lot of patience, had proven that the truth is the most powerful weapon of all. The story was over, but for Elias, a new chapter had just begun.